Hi, welcome to Examining Exam. We would like to see how the area that we have studied has been tested in your SBL exam. Now, basically, we have looked through Ethics and Professionalism chapter, and we have covered three main areas. So that includes public interest, the role of public accountant or the role of accountant to protect interests of the public. We have looked through a bit on the Code of Ethics. We have very briefly reminded you what you've studied about Code of Ethics, our fundamental principles, as well as the ethical codes applicable to the auditors. And we also looked through very specifically in terms of fraud, bribery, and corruption. Now, so these are the areas that we have covered so far. Then the questions is, how am I expected to deal with the exam question for this area? So I would like to draw your attention to March 2020. Now, this is one of the area where this has been tested. We don't have many examples, which also shows that this is not a very popular area. You can see here the requirements mention discuss the risk and the ethical issues relating to communicating the threats to the client called Rex Investment. Now, basically, this is the questions where they are saying that the CEO would like you as an external independent person to give a view, and that's because she does not really trust the view of the marketing director. So in your reply, you are supposed to give a confidential email. And the meaning of confidential means that you basically can write anything, you can be very frank, and you can hold a positions that you don't agree with the marketing director. Well, basically the CEO is not trusting the marketing director, and she hopes that you agree with her, and then you would give an email that you would lay down all the points in this case. Now, what is the case all about? It's actually the company has received an anonymous threat that they will reveal confidential data about one of their biggest client called Rex Investment. But the marketing directors basically brush off the threats and say you don't really need to deal with these things because he believed that we are an IT consultants. They will not be getting the information from us. The marketing directors is quite sure that our own internal controls are good. So now there is an issue whether or not you would like to inform your client that you have received this threat. And the questions actually focus on the risk as well as the ethical consideration. So when we look at the ethical considerations, we got to ask ourselves, like, what is actually applicable from your study in this situation? And remember, it's about ethics, it's about behavior, it's about action, and everything that we do will always be governed by something. So you got to ask yourself, is there any sets of rules that could govern our standards of behavior? Now, for example, what about ACCA fundamental principles? Now, sometimes you have to beware that not all situations that we could go to the ACCA fundamental principles because they may not be accountants. So you're talking about a company, you're talking about a CEO, unless the CEO is an accounting background. Now then that's a different story. Now, what about the company has any code of ethics? Sometimes from the case studies, you might hear the fact that, oh yeah, they have actually has an established sets of rules or sets of values that they need to observe, which then can be a source to guide your action. Then you could refer that in your case study. Now let's just look at the fundamental principles that we are aware of, which we usually refers to the COPIP, which is what you can see now on the screen. Now, which of the fundamental principle that you could use to comment on your answer as a result of these issues, that you're aware of a threat from an anonymous person that could go against the interests of your client, and now you're believing or you're being convinced by your marketing director, or he's trying to convince you to keep this as a secret. Now, which of the principle that you believe that will be most applicable over here? Now, for example, if you look at the COPIP in the screen, I believe some of you would definitely say it's issues about integrity because it goes against the principle of truthfulness, openness. Now then, if you believe that is applicable, go with that. Now you're going to use that principle and approach your question. Now, as well as the professional behavior, if we believe that this is something about withholding a very important information that could possibly and negatively affects the interests of our client, now then whether is this a right behavior for you to withhold this information. Now, this could be two principles that could be applicable. So this is not a very difficult question, considering the amount of marks that they ask is not a lot. Now, another area that we have seen something that could relate to the areas that we have studied in this syllabus is a question from the pilot paper. Now, these questions is not really about fraud and corruption, but it is a questions that says how do you suggest them to come up with measures that could reduce the level of fraud in their business, which is a railway business. It's like a subway, it's like a train station. So this is really an internal control questions about preventing fraud and not about ethics. But it is not a very difficult questions either. So it's in fact something that you could think of your answers yourself even without studying. Now, but of course you need some fundamental principles behind yourself or your knowledge to help you to develop the answer. So you got to first ask yourself why fraud occurs. Now remember, when we study internal controls, we are aware that there's this thing called the fraud triangle. Now there will only be fraud when there's an opportunity for someone to commit fraud, incentive or pressure for a person to commit fraud, and rationalization. So opportunities is like there's a weak control. Incentive is like, for example, there is some kind of payments that could entice a person to commit fraud. Or pressure is like, for example, you're in financial problems, you needed money, and that's the reason why you cheat. And rationalizations is how you convince your mind that it's all right for you to commit the fraud. Now, so when we go to the case study, this is where we're going to pick up the information that will help us to determine why is it that fraud would occur and what can we do so that we could prevent the fraud or mitigate the fraud. Now, this is one of the exhibits that I've taken from the question. So I'm just going to go straight into the key areas that they say over here. Now, one of it is they say, here in B-Land, I can only buy ticket at the station. Now, basically, the customers is complaining that why can't I buy tickets online? Now, if you can't buy tickets online, it's not very convenient. So there are people who says that, you know, it's not that I don't want to buy the tickets, it's just very difficult because the queue is very long. That's it, I'm not going to buy. What is that? That's a rationalization. So they're trying to rationalize that by not buying a ticket is the right things to do because you're not doing a service to me. Now, there's also another problems that it says over here. It says that I'm so frustrated because I see there's a lot of passengers in the train, but they're not having a tickets. Where are the ticket inspectors? So these are the people that's complaining that there's no controls in the train station. There's nobody there to go in to check whether people are actually having a tickets or not. And there's also this part that basically customers feedback and says that I don't really understand why that the price of the ticket has gone up. Now, people who cannot agree with the increase in the price would again give themselves a rationalization to say that now I don't want to buy the ticket because I don't think it's worth the money. So I would rather just go in without a ticket because, you know, I'm not going to pay for something that is not worth it. That's rationalization. Now, the other things that we could see is because when the fare of the ticket has increased, basically people find it very expensive. There are people who can't afford to pay for the ticket rather than they don't want to buy for the ticket, and that give rise to pressure. So if you're taking away all these things that we have from the case studies, then you got to ask yourself what kind of controls that we could introduce that could address the issues of opportunities, incentive, pressures, rationalization. So for example, they just mentioned there was no ticket inspector. So one of the best things that we can do is to have a ticket inspectors. Right, so I hope that this will be a very short series on exam to share with you how that your exam has tested this area of the syllabus. Thank you very much.